Most people assume reality is something they directly experience. The world appears external, stable, and obvious. You open your eyes, observe what exists, and respond to it. From the inside, perception feels immediate. It does not feel constructed, it feels received. But what you experience as reality is not raw, external information. It is a model generated by your mind from incomplete sensory input, prior expectations, emotional weighting, memory, prediction, and interpretation. The brain never accesses reality directly. It only processes signals. Light reaches the eyes, vibrations reach the ears, chemical changes reach the nervous system. From these fragments, the mind builds a coherent experience that feels continuous and stable. This construction process is necessary because the external world contains more information than consciousness could process in real time. The brain therefore compresses, filters, predicts, and simplifies constantly. What you experience is not the world itself, but a controlled interpretation designed to help you navigate efficiently. The unsettling part is not that perception can occasionally be wrong. It is that the feeling of certainty accompanies the construction automatically. You do not experience your reality as a model, you experience it as direct truth, and because the construction process remains mostly invisible, the resulting interpretation feels absolute. The mind hides its own editing. It removes awareness of prediction, filtering, emotional influence, and attentional selection, leaving behind only the finished experience. That finished experience becomes what you call reality. But the reality you experience is already shaped long before conscious awareness recognizes what has been added, removed, emphasized, or ignored beneath the surface. Perception is heavily shaped by prediction. The brain is not passively waiting for information to arrive before constructing experience. It continuously generates expectations about what it is likely to encounter next. These predictions help the system operate efficiently because fully analyzing every incoming signal from the beginning would be too slow and metabolically expensive. Instead, the mind anticipates patterns and updates them only when incoming information strongly contradicts the prediction. This means that what you perceive is partially determined before sensory information fully arrives. The brain begins constructing reality in advance, based on what it expects to see, hear, or feel. This is why familiar environments feel stable and immediate. Prediction reduces uncertainty by filling gaps automatically, but it also means that expectation quietly shapes experience itself. Two people can encounter the same situation while perceiving it differently because their predictive frameworks are different. Emotional history, memory, conditioning, and repeated experiences all influence what the mind expects to encounter. And once expectation exists, perception begins organizing itself around it. The system then experiences the resulting interpretation as objective observation rather than predictive construction. This creates the illusion that reality simply reveals itself directly. In reality, perception is a negotiation between incoming information and internally generated expectation structures that are continuously shaping what becomes consciously visible. Attention determines which parts of reality become psychologically real in the first place. The world contains far more information than awareness can consciously process at once, so the brain filters aggressively. Certain details are selected while others disappear entirely from conscious experience. But this filtering process is not neutral. Emotion, familiarity, goals, fear, desire, and prior conditioning influence what attention prioritizes automatically. This means that different people are not simply interpreting the same reality differently. In many cases, they are noticing fundamentally different portions of it. Attention creates psychological reality by deciding what enters awareness strongly enough to matter. And because attention feels effortless and immediate, the filtering process itself becomes invisible. You assume the parts of reality you notice are simply the most important or obvious aspects of the environment, but often they are the aspects your nervous system was conditioned to prioritize through repetition and emotional significance. A person repeatedly focused on rejection notices social threat cues quickly. A person repeatedly focused on status notices hierarchy cues quickly. A person repeatedly focused on danger notices uncertainty quickly. These attentional patterns shape the emotional tone of reality itself. Over time, the repeated direction of attention creates stable experiential worlds that feel objective, even though they are heavily filtered constructions shaped by internal priorities operating beneath awareness. Memory further alters reality, because the past itself is reconstructed continuously rather than stored objectively. Most people experience memory as retrieval, as though experiences are archived and replayed when recalled, but memory functions more like reconstruction. Each recollection rebuilds the experience using fragments, emotional associations, current beliefs, and interpretive frameworks. This means the past is not stable. It changes subtly depending on the state of the person remembering it. Emotional conditions influence which details become emphasized or minimized. Current identity structures shape how past events are interpreted. Over time, memories become increasingly aligned with the narratives the mind currently uses to maintain psychological coherence. This creates the illusion that the past objectively confirms present beliefs when, in reality, present beliefs are actively reshaping remembered experience itself. The reconstructed past then influences future expectations and emotional responses, reinforcing the larger construction system continuously. Reality therefore becomes temporally unstable. The present is filtered through prediction, while the past is filtered through reconstruction. Both directions are shaped by internal systems rather than direct objective access. Yet because memory feels vivid and familiar, the reconstructed experience is trusted automatically. The mind mistakes emotional familiarity for historical accuracy. Emotion changes the structure of reality by altering the significance of information before conscious reasoning fully begins. Emotional states do not simply react to reality after perception occurs. They actively shape what reality feels like while it is being constructed. Fear narrows attention toward threat. Desire amplifies rewarding possibilities. Shame alters social interpretation. Anger changes perceived intention. These emotional filters influence what information feels meaningful, urgent, or dangerous before conscious analysis fully appears. This means that different emotional states generate different experiential worlds from the same external conditions. A conversation experienced while anxious feels psychologically different from the same conversation experienced while calm, because the emotional system changed the weighting of information before conscious interpretation stabilized. Yet in both states, the resulting reality feels objectively true while it is active. The emotional framework disappears behind the certainty of the experience itself. This is why emotional states can feel like revelations rather than temporary constructions. The mind experiences emotionally filtered perception as direct insight into reality, rather than as a modified interpretation shaped by internal conditions. Over time, repeated emotional states reinforce consistent perceptual patterns until entire versions of reality become emotionally conditioned structures operating beneath awareness. Language stabilizes reality by converting fluid experience into fixed conceptual structures. The moment something is named, categorized, or described, the mind begins compressing complexity into simplified mental models. This is necessary because raw experience contains too much ambiguity for consciousness to manage continuously. Labels reduce uncertainty. They allow rapid recognition and prediction. But the simplification also changes perception itself. Once a person, emotion, event, or behavior is categorized, future experiences begin passing through the established concept automatically. The label starts determining what details feel relevant and which interpretations feel correct. This creates the illusion that concepts are revealing reality when they are often narrowing it. A person described internally as threatening begins being perceived through selective attention toward confirming behaviors. A situation categorized as failure changes emotional weighting and memory encoding immediately. The concept shapes the experience before conscious analysis fully engages. Over time, language becomes invisible because the mind stops noticing the interpretive framework itself. Reality feels self-evident, even though perception is continuously organized through conceptual systems learned socially and reinforced internally. Words do not merely describe experience after it happens. They participate in constructing the structure through which experience becomes psychologically meaningful in the first place. Social reality is constructed collectively through repeated agreement about meaning, value, and interpretation. Much of what people experience as obvious truth exists because enough minds reinforce the same conceptual structures simultaneously. Status, success, attractiveness, normality, identity, morality, even emotional expectations are heavily shaped by shared social reinforcement. These structures feel objective because they are repeated constantly across environments, institutions, language systems, and interpersonal interactions. The individual mind then internalizes them until they feel self-generated. This creates a powerful illusion. Socially reinforced interpretations begin feeling identical to direct perception. A person may believe they independently value certain goals or identities, while those values were largely constructed through repeated cultural exposure operating beneath conscious awareness. The system adapts to repeated social signals automatically because belonging and predictability reduce uncertainty. Over time, externally reinforced meanings become integrated into personal reality structures themselves. This is why entire societies can normalize perceptions, fears, aspirations, or emotional patterns that feel individually obvious to the people inside them. Reality is not only constructed internally, it is stabilized socially through repeated collective reinforcement that becomes psychologically invisible once fully integrated into perception. The body also participates in constructing reality more than people realize. Physical states continuously influence emotional interpretation, attention, motivation, and cognitive processing. Exhaustion changes perceived difficulty. Hunger changes emotional reactivity. Stress changes threat detection. Hormonal shifts alter motivation and social interpretation. Yet these physical influences rarely feel external. The resulting perceptions feel like objective conclusions about reality itself. A person under chronic stress genuinely experiences the world as more urgent, unstable, and threatening because the nervous system alters perceptual weighting automatically. Another person in a calm physiological state experiences the same environment differently because the body changed the construction process before conscious awareness interpreted the situation. This demonstrates that reality is not generated solely by abstract thought. It emerges through interactions between nervous system states, emotional weighting, memory, prediction, and environmental input operating simultaneously. The conscious mind then experiences the final integrated output as a unified world without directly perceiving the underlying biological conditions shaping it. Because bodily influence remains mostly invisible during experience itself, people often mistake temporary physiological states for permanent truths about reality. Repetition strengthens constructed reality by increasing familiarity. The mind trusts what it encounters repeatedly because repetition improves predictive efficiency. Familiar ideas, emotional patterns, social interpretations, and attentional habits become easier to process over time. Ease of processing then creates a sensation of truth. What feels immediate and effortless begins appearing self-evident. This is one reason repeated narratives become so psychologically powerful. The more often a thought, interpretation, or emotional framework is reinforced, the more natural it feels. Eventually, alternatives begin feeling unrealistic simply because they are less familiar. This applies to personal identity, political beliefs, emotional reactions, fears, desires, and entire worldviews. Repetition reduces friction until the constructed framework disappears beneath the experience itself. The person no longer feels like they are interpreting reality through learned structures. They feel like they're simply seeing reality clearly. This is why deeply repeated systems of interpretation become difficult to question. The mind mistakes familiarity for objectivity, but familiarity often reflects reinforcement rather than accuracy. Constructed realities become strongest when repetition makes the construction process invisible. The unsettling implication is not that reality is fake. It is that experience is always mediated through systems the mind cannot fully observe while they are operating. You never encounter raw reality untouched by interpretation, because interpretation is the mechanism through which conscious experience becomes possible at all. The brain must simplify, filter, predict, compress, prioritize, and emotionally weight information continuously in order to construct a usable world. Without construction, experience would collapse into overwhelming fragmentation. The problem is not that the system constructs reality. The problem is that the system hides the construction while convincing you that the final experience is direct truth. Once this becomes visible, certainty changes. Thoughts still appear convincing, emotions still feel real, perception still feels immediate, but they no longer feel completely transparent. You begin recognizing that experience itself emerges from layered processes operating beneath awareness, rather than from direct contact with objective reality untouched by interpretation. And that realization changes the relationship between consciousness and the world entirely. This invisibility is what gives constructed reality its power. If the mind openly displayed every filter, prediction, emotional weighting process, and attentional bias while experience was occurring, perception would feel uncertain and unstable constantly. The system, therefore, removes awareness of its own construction methods to preserve coherence. You experience the finished interpretation without witnessing the assembly process underneath it. This creates the sensation that reality simply appears as it is. But the feeling of immediacy is itself part of the construction. The mind edits out hesitation, uncertainty, and competing interpretations before conscious awareness fully stabilizes around one version of events. Once stabilization occurs, the selected interpretation feels complete. This is why people can hold radically different perceptions of the same event while both experiencing absolute certainty. The certainty does not come from objective access to reality. It comes from the mind successfully finalizing a coherent construction that feels internally stable, and because the construction process itself remains hidden, the resulting perception feels self-evident rather than assembled. The system protects coherence by making interpretation invisible. That invisibility is what allows constructed realities to feel indistinguishable from direct truth. Identity acts as another stabilizing force inside constructed reality because the mind continuously organizes perception around maintaining a coherent sense of self. Experiences are not interpreted neutrally. They are interpreted in relation to who the system currently believes you are. Information consistent with identity structures receives less resistance and integrates more easily into perception. Contradictory information creates tension because it threatens continuity. This means identity does not merely exist inside reality construction. It actively shapes the reality being constructed. A person who sees themselves as inadequate perceives feedback differently than someone who sees themselves as capable. The same interaction produces different emotional conclusions because identity altered interpretation before conscious reasoning fully formed. Over time, the identity structure begins selecting evidence that reinforces itself while filtering out experiences that create instability. The resulting world feels increasingly aligned with the self-concept already being maintained internally. Reality becomes partially self-confirming, because perception is being continuously organized around identity preservation, and because identity itself was built through repetition, emotional conditioning, memory reconstruction, and social reinforcement, the final experience feels deeply personal while remaining heavily constructed beneath awareness. Control inside this system is more limited than people usually imagine, because conscious awareness operates within the construction rather than outside it. Most people unconsciously picture themselves as observers, objectively evaluating reality from a neutral position. But consciousness itself is embedded inside the same predictive, emotional, attentional, and interpretive systems shaping experience. The thoughts used to analyze reality are already influenced by the framework constructing reality in the first place. This is why simply thinking harder rarely produces fully objective perception. The analysis itself emerges from conditioned structures operating beneath awareness. Every conclusion is shaped by what the system notices, predicts, emotionally emphasizes, and remembers. This does not make awareness meaningless, but it changes what awareness actually is. Consciousness becomes less like an independent controller and more like a process participating inside a larger construction system it cannot fully observe in real time. The mind then compresses this complexity into the simplified feeling of, I am seeing reality clearly. That simplification is psychologically useful because it creates stability and decisiveness. But it also conceals how dependent perception is on invisible structures continuously shaping experience before conscious interpretation fully appears. The reason constructed reality feels emotionally convincing is because survival depends more on functional interpretation than objective accuracy. The brain evolved to create useful models, not perfectly truthful ones. A perception that improves adaptation is prioritized even if it simplifies or distorts aspects of reality. Fear exaggerates threat because missing danger carries risk. Social sensitivity exaggerates rejection because exclusion historically threatens survival. Emotional memory prioritizes painful experiences because avoiding repeated harm increases predictability. These distortions are not errors from the system's perspective. They are adaptive constructions optimized for efficiency and survival under uncertainty. The problem arises when the mind mistakes adaptive usefulness for objective truth. Once that confusion occurs, constructed interpretations begin feeling unquestionable. Emotional certainty reinforces perceptual certainty. Familiarity reinforces conceptual certainty. Social reinforcement strengthens both. Eventually, the person experiences a highly stabilized reality model that feels entirely natural while remaining deeply shaped by mechanisms designed for prediction and adaptation rather than objective transparency. The system does not ask whether reality is perfectly accurate. It asks whether the construction is stable enough to navigate effectively. The shift begins when construction itself becomes visible, not intellectually but experientially. You start noticing how attention changes perception, how emotion changes interpretation, how prediction fills gaps before awareness recognizes uncertainty, how memory reshapes the past to preserve coherence, how identity filters meaning automatically. Reality does not disappear once these processes become visible. The world still feels immediate, emotions still feel real, thoughts still emerge automatically. But they lose the sensation of absolute transparency. Experience begins feeling mediated rather than final, and within that realization, certainty softens. The goal is not to escape construction completely, because conscious experience depends on construction to exist at all. The goal is to recognize that what feels self-evident is often the product of hidden processes operating beneath awareness continuously. Once that becomes visible, the relationship between mind and reality changes fundamentally. Reality stops appearing as something directly received and starts appearing as something continuously assembled in real time by systems that shape what you experience long before you consciously recognize how much of the experience was already constructed for you.